Okay, so continuing our conversation of industry and immigration, continuing to look out for these key terms, both as we listen and read, with that little star indicating where some might be. Continuing to think about these sort of driving topics, this idea of rapid industrialization, new types of immigrant groups into the United States, and new technologies. We're going to talk also a lot about unions today. How are Americans going to be addressing some of the negative effects of industrialization? Because, of course, there are some. We are also going to continue to look at these questions, which I explained in part one of this topic presentation. So I would invite you to make sure that you understand and know these, because these might come back to you in the form of a quiz or a test or a writing assignment. You just never know. Okay, so we talked a little bit about robber barons in our last conversation. We're sort of going to continue that in our conversation about the rise of big businesses and this idea of corporations, which are in fact treated as a person under the law. I know that sounds crazy. If you guys remember who Mitt Romney is, he ran for president. And at one point, it was really controversial because he was asked if corporations were people, and he said yes, and people were sort of shocked by that. But under the law, corporations are treated as people, which means they have the same sort of freedoms that people have. That's sort of important to keep in mind. Corporations are also owned by groups of people. You might think of them as stockholders. So if we reference a group of stockholders, we're referencing a group of corporate owners. Corporations sell stocks because it spreads out the risk. Instead of one person who owns the money, several people do, sometimes hundreds of people do, and that will spread out the risk to that, the financial risk to that corporation. We also have, because we have so much money in these new corporations, an investment in new technology, larger workforces, different types of machines, and we are talking about economies of scale. So things are sort of operating on a supply and demand type situation, if you want to think about that. We can also think about corporations in terms of fixed costs. Fixed costs are expenses that occur no matter what, and operating costs, expenses that occur only when those businesses are running. Because of fixed costs and operating costs, larger businesses usually have more of an advantage than smaller businesses because their fixed costs are higher than their operating costs. So if there is any kind of an economic problem, that larger business can still stay up and running because it makes more sense for them to continue to operate. But smaller businesses can't survive. So as we move forward in time, we see larger businesses thriving, these corporations sort of taking over, and these smaller businesses that can't keep up falling by the wayside. This is a nice little chart that sort of details the changing structure of businesses, and it's asking you to think about the expansion of markets. So also the question down here, contrast the differences between a family-owned business and a corporation. So I'd invite you to sort of pause here and study this chart, family-owned versus corporation. There are some benefits of consolidating industry, and here I want to mention somebody named Andrew Carnegie. He is a Scottish immigrant who is known for being a steel tycoon. And he is also known for something called vertical integration. That's a very important vocab term. We need to know the difference between vertical integration and horizontal integration, which I'm going to talk about in a second. This is one of those business management styles that I mentioned in the intro slide. One of those introductory slides is going to be important to understand. Vertical integration is when you buy all the raw materials to make products as well as the shipping and transportation to deliver to the company. So Carnegie buys the raw materials, Carnegie owns the manufacturing plant, and Carnegie owns the means of distribution. So he owns the means by which the raw materials are gotten. So think about iron mines. He owns the steel company that turns the iron ore into steel using that Bessemer process that we talked about last time. And then he also owns the railroad that distributes it. So anything to do with steel from sort of start to finish, Carnegie, vertical integration. Horizontal integration. We want to associate with a man named Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller. He is going to be the sort of leader of horizontal integration, which means he owns all the same types of businesses, right? He's going to own all of the oil companies, not necessarily like the means of production and then the means of distribution. He just owns all of the oil companies. It also says something about monopolies. When you have vertical integration and horizontal integration, you have a couple of companies owning all of the same resource, all of that same business organization. And so these trusts or monopolies start to form, and they're really, really, really giant. And some Americans and some government officials begin to think that this might not be the best idea for the American economy. Once you get to a point where just a few businesses are controlling everything, do you still have competition? Is there still a sort of motivation to innovate? What is your motivation to try new things? What is your motivation to become more efficient? You don't have one. At that point, you already control everything and you are just going to be focused on making money. Investment banking becomes really important during this time period. Also, Morgan Stanley, you might have heard of that company, is going to be an important leader in investment banking. Banks that invest in these large corporations. So this is a nice little infographic here on vertical versus horizontal integration, and think about the differences between the two. John D. Rockefeller, horizontal integration; Carnegie, vertical integration. Although here, let me go back to this real quick. You can look at it both ways, right? I don't want you to think that Rockefeller was like anti-vertical integration or anything like that. Okay. So selling the product. So how are you advertising? Advertising catalogs become really important. This is Sears, right? That you would get your catalog in the mail. I don't know, maybe some of you guys still get like a Christmas catalog in the mail where you go through and circle everything. I know my kids look forward to that small little booklet that Target puts out. They'll go through and circle their little Christmas list. But you used to order everything, through the mail in these large corporations. Sears is kind of the last one left. They're not doing so great. As industrialization intensifies, the success of the booming American economy relies heavily on its workers. Y'all, working conditions are just terrible. I think we all know this about the American economy. There's going to be some more activities in your folders that sort of stress this point. Workers are not doing well. Workers are not doing well. So they're going to start to form unions. You leave the farm and you come to the city because you can make more money, but the working conditions are terrible. And as wages start to decrease, as the economy is sort of sluggish in the late 1800s, the economy sort of slows down for a bit. So wages drop because prices of goods are dropping. All that is to say, workers decide that they need bargaining power. There's going to be two types of workers that live in these cities. There's going to be craft workers and common laborers. Craft workers have a special skill, some type of training. Common laborers have very few skills. Think of them as just sort of what we would maybe imagine as assembly line workers who have one job and do that job over and over. They may do it well, but they're not, a trained carpenter, for example, or a trained steel worker. Those are different. Now, if you are a craft worker, you're making more money than if you are a common laborer, and they're also going to form their own unions. It's a struggle, especially in the beginning, to organize. The first sort of strikes that we're going to see are the railroad strikes. due to a recession in 1873. Railroad strikes are terrifying for the American government and also for the American people because railroads are so important. If you don't have railroads, you do not have an economy, an industrial economy. I think we have stressed that quite a bit. So the Great Railroad Strike is something to keep in mind. How does the government respond to strikes? A lot of times they send in the National Guard. They try to sort of violently suppress these strikes, and that's important to understand because how the government responds to unions is going to change over time. The importance of unions is going to change over time. But this is the beginning here. This is how the government and the union leaders are sort of figuring out what their relationship is going to be. The Knights of Labor is going to be founded by a man named Terence Powderly in 1869. That's going to be an important name for you to remember. They wanted to boycott. They didn't want to negotiate with their company leaders. They wanted an 8-hour workday. I mean, yes, please, right? They wanted to end child labor, and they wanted worker-owned factories. And a key thing to know about the Knights of Labor is that African American workers are allowed to join. A lot of these labor unions are going to restrict who can join. The Haymarket Riot is a really important riot during this time period.
Hi, I'm
play a video
Williams.
for you.
I'm a historian, and here's what you need to know in order to sound smart about the Haymarket Square Riot. The Haymarket Square Riot of 1886 had its origins in labor unrest that extended back to the decades after the Civil War. American laborers were particularly concerned about issues including the length of the workday and working conditions. The American labor movement at that time was also being influenced by more radical voices. Many of these individuals believed that not only should working conditions be improved, but that the entire capitalistic enterprise be smashed. On May 3rd, 1886, several workers were killed by police in a showdown at the McCormick Reaper plant in Chicago. Labor organizers called for a mass meeting and rally the following night at Haymarket Square. After one speaker, Samuel Felden, made a particularly inflammatory statement, police moved in to shut down the rally. As they were moving toward the stage, however, an unknown person tossed a bomb in their midst. In the ensuing violence, 7 police officers were killed, and as many as 5 civilians wounded. In the absence of any real suspects, authorities turned their attention to the more radical influences in the labor movement. Despite the lack of any tangible evidence, 8 men were eventually arrested and put on trial. All 8 were convicted. In the end, 4 of those convicted were executed on November 11, 1887. Of the 3 remaining who had been convicted, 1 committed suicide, and the other 2 were ultimately pardoned by the governor of Illinois due to a public backlash against the unfair way in which the defendants had been treated. The 4 men who were executed in 1887 became international symbols of the struggle between capital and labor and the fight to ensure fair labor practices for all workers. Young people in large numbers came.
All right. The Homestead and Pullman strikes are incredibly important. The Homestead, Pennsylvania steel mill is going to be owned by Carnegie, but managed by a guy named Frick, Henry Clay Frick, who's obviously very anti-union. He's going to cut wages by 20%. He's going to say if you are part of a union, you can't work here. And he's going to hire a sort of, I'm going to say mercenary. That's really harsh. But an independent detective agency called the Pinkertons. And don't let the word detective mislead you. Like, they're just kind of armed thugs. And they're going to bring in people who will work without joining a union. There's a very violent conflict that lasts for 4 months, ultimately. The Pullman Railroad Company, a Pullman car, right? They are going to strike over issues related to their company town.
In the early 18th.
A company town is a place that is owned, a town that is owned by the company. And a lot of times the company would pay a worker a wage and then add on to that company money that they could use to buy things in a company store. If you have ever seen that movie or read the book October Sky, I know that used to be required reading at Houston. I don't know if it still is. The coal mining town that the kid lives in, that is a company town. So they're given a place to live. but their wages are incredibly low for that. And the company sort of thinks that they're making up for not paying the workers well or treating them well by providing for their families.
In the early 1880s, labor conditions were pretty hard. A lot of new immigrants were coming to America. They were reasonably unskilled, but often quite cheap labor, and they were exploited for such. So that the typical work day could be 12 hours. They often worked 6 days a week, sometimes 7 days a week. Child labor was not allowed, but it wasn't regulated, and so kids as young as 6, 7, 8, 10 worked in the mills, and the conditions were not terribly safe. There were terrible accidents that occurred. The first Labor Day was September 1882. The founder probably was Matthew McGuire. He helped to organize a major march and demonstration to affirm labor's rights. And 10,000 people marched. That was a Tuesday. It was the first Tuesday in September. What triggered a national Labor Day in 1894 was a rather dramatic strike that took place. The Pullman workers in Chicago went out on strike. The federal government intervened because the Pullman cars, basically, with a boycott of them, stopped the American railway system from operating. So the federal troops were called out to crush the strike. People were killed. It was a terribly violent strike. It was not a happy day for labor. Government, being politicians, wanted labor on their side, and so as a concession, they then passed legislation authorizing a Labor Day. First Monday in September from then on. Labor Day has evolved since 1894. Increasingly, even the marches and the parades became really opportunities for a patriotic holiday more than actually a celebration of labor per se.
But the union makes us strong.
We have paid holidays because of the labor movement. We have an 8-hour day because of the labor movement. We have paid vacations because of the labor movement. We have health care, those of us who still have it, because of the labor movement. And it's a chance really to recognize those kinds of games. But over time, it's become much more than that. It has become, for all of us, the marker of the end of summer, the beginning of school, an opportunity for picnics, for barbecues. In its own way, ironically, Labor Day is as much about consumption as it is about labor nowadays. I'd like to think that the problems facing labor and unemployment are on people's minds. I'm sure that they are on people's minds. I'm not sure that Labor Day is triggering those concerns anymore. And that's unfortunate.
All right, so happy Labor Day, right? Coming up. This is a nice, again, infographic for the company town in Pullman, Illinois, which is really sort of exemplary of a lot of different company towns in the United States during this time period. So the question on there is, what reasons account for the workers' complaints about Pullman? Just very quickly, in Tennessee, there's something that happens called the Coal Creek Labor Saga, where coal miners are going to strike against the Tennessee Mining Company. There is something called a convict lease program that Governor Buchanan is going to sort of pioneer. Essentially, prisoners are being put to work in the mines, and there is a massive amount of violence and destruction from about 1891 to 1893. So anytime there's something about Tennessee history, we should sort of pay attention to that. Unions also are going to emerge primarily, as we said, to serve trade workers. Make sure you know a guy named Samuel Gompers. Make sure you know what the AFL is, what the Industrial Workers of the World is, or the Wobblies, that's going to be established to bring in unskilled workers. And make sure you know a guy named Eugene V. Debs. He's going to be a very important union leader. Women make up 18% of the workforce by 1900, but are not allowed to be involved in a lot of the existing unions. And so you see women start their own workers' unions. For example, 1900, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. And here is a chart of some influential labor unions, the date they were founded, and what their significance was. Make sure that you understand that. Thanks, guys. Let me know if you have any questions about this part.